I remember the exact sensation of my consciousness fragmenting. Not pain, though pain was there, constant and overwhelming, but the specific feeling of my mind being carved into pieces while I remained aware enough to feel each cut. The tech priests had made an error during my conversion. Some microscopic deviation in the mind-wipe protocols, some fault in the chemical dosing, some infinitesimal miscalibration in the augmetic crown they bolted through my skull and into my brain tissue. The result was catastrophic failure of the erasure process. They had taken my body, stripped away my autonomy, installed their machinery and programming, but they had left me inside. Me, Matthias Keld, 23 standard years old, son of Sereth, brother to Davian and Corsae, worker designation 447, 783, 4 of Manufactorum Complex Theta 447, sublevel 7, assembly line 93. I remained, a fragment, a shard, a ghost trapped inside flesh that had been converted into machinery. And I have been aware, conscious, thinking, experiencing, for every single moment of the 200 years since. If you've ever wondered what it means to be truly helpless, imagine this. Your arm reaches forward. You did not will it to move. You cannot prevent it from moving. The fingers, servo-mechanical digits that replaced your flesh months ago, close around a tool with perfect precision. You feel the imperative firing in your brain. Feel the programming override coursing through neural pathways you no longer control. Feel the electrical impulses that activate muscle tissue according to subroutines you never learned, but now execute flawlessly. You are a passenger. You are a witness. You are a consciousness imprisoned in a body that belongs to someone else's commands. This is my existence. This has been my existence since the day they brought me to the conversion chambers. And this will be my existence until my biological systems finally fail completely, which, given the augmetic life extension systems they've installed, may not occur for another century or more. Let me tell you how I got here. Let me tell you what it costs to become a servitor. Let me tell you what the Imperium does to those it deems suitable for conversion. Because once you understand, once you truly comprehend what happens in those processing chambers, you'll never look at a servitor the same way again. You'll wonder every time you see one performing its tasks with blank-eyed efficiency whether someone is still inside, whether they're screaming in a silence so complete that no one will ever hear them. Before the selection, my life was unremarkable in the way that billions of Imperial citizens' lives are unremarkable. I lived in Hive Primus, Tertius Sector, Hab Block 447, Theta, Unit 937. The Hab unit was 17 meters square, large enough for 4 people if you didn't mind sharing sleeping space and never having a moment of privacy. My mother Sereth worked third shift at Textile Manufactorum 892, operating looms that wove fabric for Imperial Guard uniforms. 16 hours a day, 6 days a week, for wages that barely covered our ration allotments and Hab unit fees. My father had died when I was 14. A conveyor accident in the ore processing facility where he'd worked for 27 years. The machinery had caught his leg, pulled him into gears that couldn't be stopped because stopping the production line cost the Imperium more than the life of a single worker. They'd scraped what remained of him into a waste container and sent my mother a notification form. No compensation. No apology, just a stamped document confirming that worker designation 447-6421 had been terminated due to safety protocol violation. My brothers were 11 and 9 when I was taken. Davian wanted to be a guardsman. He'd seen recruitment posters and believed the propaganda about glory and honor. Corse was quieter, spent his time sketching pictures on scraps of reclaimed paper, drawing things he'd never seen. Birds, trees, open sky. Neither of them would ever see those things. Neither of them would ever leave the hive. They would work in manufactorums until their bodies failed, and then they would be rendered into corpse starch to feed the next generation of workers. Unless they were selected for something worse. I worked in Sublevel 7, deep enough that you never saw natural light, never felt wind, never experienced anything except the constant heat and noise and chemical stench of industrial production. My job was assembly, taking circuit components blessed by tech priests and installing them into Vox relay housings according to patterns I'd memorized through 5 years of repetition. 8 hours of work earned you 1 ration token. 16-hour shifts were standard. Sleep 4 hours, work 16, spend the remaining 4 hours traveling to and from the manufactorum, eating your rations, and trying not to think about the fact that this was your entire life and would be your entire life until your body failed. The manufactorum floor held 4,000 workers at any given time. The sound was a physical presence, grinding metal, hissing steam, the rhythmic pounding of stamping presses, the constant mechanical roar of assembly lines that never stopped because stopping cost the Imperium productivity, and productivity was the only measure of value that mattered. The air tasted of machine oil and ozone, and atomized metal particles that coated your lungs and would eventually kill you through slow accumulation of industrial poisons. The heat rose from the machinery in waves that made the air shimmer, and by the end of each shift, your coveralls were soaked through with sweat that stank of chemicals and desperation. I had been working there for 5 years when they came for me. 5 years of the same routine, the same tasks, the same crushing monotony punctuated by occasional injuries, and the rare death when someone got careless or unlucky, or simply too exhausted to maintain proper safety protocols. 5 years of believing that this was my life, unchanging, until age or accident or accumulated toxins finally ended it. I was wrong. What waited for me was so much worse than a lifetime of manufacturum labor that I would have wept with gratitude if they'd simply left me there. The day of my selection started like every other day. I woke in darkness. The HAB unit's lumen had burned out weeks ago, and replacement bulbs required requisition forms that took months to process. I ate my morning ration, a compressed bar of nutrients that tasted like copper and sawdust, washed down with recycled water that carried a faint chemical sweetness that never quite masked the taste of purification additives. My mother was already gone, her shift having started 2 hours earlier. My brothers were still sleeping, their thin bodies curled together for warmth in the HAB unit's perpetual chill. I left without waking them. I wish now that I'd said goodbye, that I'd told them I loved them, that I'd taken one last moment to simply look at their faces and commit them to memory. But I didn't know. I couldn't have known. The Imperium doesn't announce when it's going to take you. It just takes. The transit tube to sub-level 7 was packed with workers from the night shift ending and day shift beginning. Thousands of bodies pressed together in corridors designed for hundreds, the air thick with the smell of unwashed flesh and chemical residue. No one spoke. Speaking required energy better conserved for the work ahead. We moved in silence, a river of human labor flowing toward the manufactorums that consumed us. I reached my station at the beginning of the shift cycle. Station 447, 932847, Assembly Line 93, Sub-Level 7. I'd stood in this exact spot for 5 years, performing the same task with such repetition that my hands moved automatically, requiring almost no conscious thought. Install relay component A into housing slot 1. Apply blessed oil to contact points. Install component B into slot 2. Secure with blessed fasteners. Pass completed unit to the next station. Repeat, repeat, repeat. 4,000 times per shift. 16 hours every day. The shift had progressed for approximately 3 hours when the manufacturing floor's main doors opened and the tech priests entered. The sound didn't stop, couldn't stop, but something changed in the atmosphere. Workers who had been moving with mechanical efficiency suddenly became more rigid, more careful, more desperate not to draw attention. Everyone knew what it meant when the mechanicus came to a manufacturing floor. They were selecting, and no one who was selected ever came back. There were 3 of them, tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus, their crimson robes pristine in contrast to our stained coveralls. their augmatic enhancements visible beneath the fabric, mechadendrites writhing like serpents, optical implants glowing with sickly green luminescence, vox grills replacing mouths that could no longer form human speech. They were accompanied by 6 Skitarii Rangers, augmented soldiers whose humanity had been systematically removed and replaced with machinery optimized for violence. The lead tech priest, I would later learn his designation was Magos Heretis, 7. Alpha carried a data slate that glowed with scrolling text. He moved through the manufacturum floor with mechanical precision, his movements too smooth, too calculated, inhuman in their perfection. Workers scrambled to clear a path. Overseers prostrated themselves and began babbling prayers to the Omnissiah. The Magos stopped. His optical implants tracked across the assembly line, scanning, analyzing, processing data I couldn't see. Then he spoke, his voice emerging from a vox grill in his throat, stripped of all human inflection, and rendered into pure mechanical sound. Worker designation 447-7834. Matthias Keld, age 23 standard years. Blood type AB negative universal acceptor. Genetic markers mutation-free. Physical condition acceptable tolerance to industrial toxins. Psychological profile compliant, no history of behavioral deviation. Cranial capacity suitable for beta-level programming architecture. Step forward for selection. I didn't understand. The words made sense individually, but together they formed something incomprehensible, something that my mind rejected, because accepting it meant accepting that my life was about to end. I stood frozen at my station, my hands still holding a partially assembled Vox relay component, while 4,000 workers watched in absolute silence. Compliance is mandatory, the Mago stated. Resistance will be categorized as behavioral deviation and corrected through pacification protocols. 2 Skitarii moved toward me. Their movements were liquid, efficient, predatory. One of them grabbed my arm. His grip was cold even through my coverall sleeve, pressure calculated to the exact threshold between restraint and damage. The other removed the Vox relay component from my hands with surprising gentleness, as though the machinery was more valuable than the human holding it. "Please," I managed to say, the word scraping out of a throat that had suddenly constricted. "Please, I don't understand. What did I do? Why?" "You have been selected for Servitor conversion," the Magos said. "Your biological and psychological parameters meet the requirements for general labor servitor classification. You should consider this an honor. You will serve the Omnissiah. You will achieve unity with the blessed machine. Your flesh will be perfected through augmentation. Honor." The word echoed in my skull, absurd and horrifying. They were going to convert me into a servitor, into one of those blank-eyed, shambling things that performed tasks throughout the hive, neither fully human nor fully machine, just empty biological machinery that moved according to programming. And they called it an honor. "My family," I said desperately. "My mother, my brothers. They need emotional attachments, are irrelevant to function," the Magos interrupted. "Your designation will be removed from HAB unit registries. Your ration allotment will be redistributed. Your genetic material has been recorded and may be utilized for future reproduction if the administrator determines population replacement is necessary. Your previous existence is terminated. Your new existence begins with conversion." The Skitarii began dragging me toward the main doors. I tried to resist, tried to plant my feet, tried to do anything except allow myself to be taken. But the Skitarii were stronger than human, their augmented musculature capable of force that made my resistance meaningless. I might as well have been trying to move a building. I looked back at the assembly line, at the 4,000 workers who watched in silence, at my station, where someone would be assigned within the hour to continue the work I'd been doing, at the manufacturum floor that had been my entire world for 5 years. No one met my eyes. No one spoke. No one moved to help me. They couldn't. Helping would mean being selected themselves. Speaking would draw attention. All they could do was watch and be grateful it wasn't them, and hope that their own names never appeared on a selection list. The last thing I saw before the doors closed was my friend Jens. We'd worked adjacent stations for 3 years, had shared our rations when one of us ran short, had sometimes talked during the brief rest periods about dreams we knew would never come true. He was looking at me. Just looking. His face was empty of expression, carefully neutral, because showing sympathy might be interpreted as behavioral deviation. Then the doors closed, and I was removed from the manufactorum, removed from my life, removed from everything that had made me Matthias Keld. They took me through corridors I'd never seen, upper levels of the hive where the air was clean enough to breathe, without tasting metal, where the walls were maintained rather than corroding, where tech priests and administrators walked with purpose instead of the shambling exhaustion of manufacturing workers. The skitterai pulled me through a maze of passages until we reached a massive facility whose entrance was marked with the gear and skull symbol of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Inside was a processing chamber. Cold, sterile, illuminated by harsh white lux globes that made everything sharp-edged and merciless. Servitors moved through the space with mechanical efficiency, carrying equipment, preparing stations, performing tasks I couldn't identify. I stared at them, these things that had been human once, and tried to understand what I was looking at. Their eyes were empty, not closed, not blind, but empty in a way that was worse than death. They stared at nothing, focused on nothing, acknowledged nothing except the tasks they performed. Some of them still had human faces, though their expressions never changed. Others had been so heavily modified that almost nothing organic remained except perhaps fragments of flesh stretched over augmetic frameworks. This was what I was going to become. This emptiness, this absence of self. This hollow shell that moved and functioned but contained nothing that could be called human. I started screaming then, started fighting, started doing everything I could to break free, to escape, to avoid the fate that waited in this chamber. The Skitari held me easily, their augmented strength making my struggle pointless, while tech priests approached with instruments I didn't recognize. One of them, a junior adept whose face was still partially human, scanned my body with a device that clicked and hummed. "Physiology confirmed suitable," he reported in a voice that showed no emotion. "Musculature adequate for labor classification. Bone density sufficient for augmetic integration. Neural tissue shows no degradation markers. Recommend standard beta-level conversion with reinforced spinal augmentation and dual servo arm installation." They were discussing my body like it was raw material to be processed, like I was already dead. Like the person screaming and begging and pleading for mercy was irrelevant to the procedure they were about to perform. "Please," I begged, abandoning all dignity, all pride, everything except the desperate hope that some fragment of humanity remained in these tech priests that might respond to pleading. "Please don't do this. I'll work harder. I'll accept any assignment. I'll do anything. Please don't take me. My mother needs me. My brothers need me. Please." "Emotional attachment is a weakness of the flesh," the junior adept said, still not looking at me, still focused on his instruments and readings. "You are fortunate. Through conversion, you will transcend such weakness. You will achieve perfect unity of purpose. You will serve without doubt, without fear, without the burdens of consciousness that limit human efficiency. Without consciousness." They were going to erase me, completely. They were going to take everything that made me Matthias Keld, my memories, my thoughts, my sense of self, and delete it as thoroughly as wiping data from a cogitator. The body would remain augmented and programmed, but the person would be gone. I wished for death then, prayed for it, begged whatever gods might exist in the universe to kill me before the conversion could begin. But the Emperor, they told us, protected humanity, didn't intervene. The Omnissiah the tech priests worshipped didn't grant mercy. There was only the cold efficiency of the Mechanicus, and the procedure that would transform me from person to tool. The skittery forced me into a restraint frame, a metal structure that locked around my limbs and torso, holding me completely immobile. My arms were extended, my legs spread, my head locked in position by clamps that dug into my skull. I couldn't move, couldn't escape, could only wait while they prepared the instruments that would unmake me. If this glimpse into what conversion truly means weighs on your heart, leave a comment with the word "witnessed" and subscribe so their story endures. Let someone, somewhere, acknowledge what they suffered. A tech priest approached with a syringe larger than any I'd ever seen. The needle was the length of my hand, and the barrel contained fluid that glowed with faint blue luminescence. "Chemical preparation initiating," he announced. "Subject will experience consciousness degradation, metabolic suppression, and neural plasticity enhancement. Pain response will remain active to ensure proper pathway formation during augmetic integration." They were going to leave me able to feel pain, intentionally, because my nervous system screaming as they installed their machinery was somehow beneficial to the process. The needle pierced my neck. I felt the fluid entering my bloodstream, spreading through my body like ice water, and within seconds everything began to change. My vision blurred. My thoughts became sluggish, fragmented, difficult to hold together. My body temperature dropped so rapidly that I began shivering violently, my muscles spasming against the restraints. My heart rate slowed to a rhythm that felt wrong, too slow, not enough to sustain life. But I didn't die. They wouldn't let me die. Death would have been mercy, and mercy was not part of the conversion process. Through the chemical haze, I watched them bring the augmetics. Servo arms that would replace my own, heavy mechanical limbs ending in gripping tools and manipulator claws, spinal reinforcement rods that would be installed directly into my vertebrae, the augmetic crown, a metal ring studded with electrode probes designed to penetrate my skull and interface with my brain tissue. Neural plugs that would be driven into my spine, creating connection points for machinery to integrate with my nervous system. Each piece was inscribed with symbols I couldn't read, blessed with oils whose scent was cloying and chemical, treated with rituals that the tech priests believed would please their machine god. They weren't just installing augmetics. They were performing a religious ceremony, and I was the sacrifice. The lead tech priest, Magos Heretis, 7. Alpha raised his hands in a gesture that might have been benediction. When he spoke, his voice was joined by the voices of every other tech priest in the chamber, creating a chorus of mechanical sound that resonated in my bones. Flesh is weak, steel is strong. Thought is slow. The machine is swift. Will is flawed. Programming is perfect. Let this flesh be blessed through unity with the divine machine. Let this consciousness be elevated through submission to sacred protocols. Let this weakness be purged through the holy fire of transformation. Praise the Omnisire. Praise the machine god. Praise the eternal fusion of flesh and steel. Then they began cutting. The pain was immediate. Total, overwhelming. They started with my arms, using surgical saws that shrieked as they cut through flesh and bone. I felt every second of it, felt the blade biting into muscle, felt the friction heat burning tissue, felt my bones splintering under the pressure. I screamed until my voice broke, until my throat was raw, until all that emerged was a horrible rasping sound that didn't seem human anymore. My right arm came off first. They dropped it into a waste container without ceremony. Just meat now, irrelevant biological material to be rendered into chemical components. Then the left. Both gone within minutes, leaving me with stumps that bled despite the cauterization tools they used, despite the chemicals flooding my system, despite everything. The servo arms came next. They positioned the heavy mechanical limbs against the augmetic sockets they'd bolted to my shoulders, then activated the connection sequence. I felt something forcing its way into my nervous system. Felt foreign neural pathways attempting to integrate with my own. felt programming beginning to load into sections of my brain that had never been designed to process machine language. The pain was different now, not cutting, but burning from the inside, electrical fire racing through my nerves as machinery attempted to interface with biology. My body rejected the intrusion. My immune system tried desperately to fight the foreign material, but the augmetics included suppressant systems that forced acceptance, that made my flesh accommodate the machinery whether it wanted to or not. They moved to my spine next, cut through the muscles of my back, peeled away tissue, and exposed my vertebrae. The reinforcement rods were cold when they touched bone. I felt the temperature difference even through the pain. They drilled directly into my spine, each insertion sending shockwaves through my entire body, and installed the rods that would support the weight of the servo arms and prevent my organic skeleton from collapsing under the mechanical augmentation. The neural plugs followed, jacks installed along my spinal column, creating ports where machinery could connect directly to my nervous system. Each one felt like a spike driven into the core of my being, violating something fundamental, turning my body into an interface rather than a self-contained organism. And through it all, I remained conscious. The chemicals prevented me from passing out, kept me aware for every single second, ensured that I experienced the full horror of my transformation. They wanted me conscious, needed me conscious. Because consciousness was what they were going to destroy next, and destroying something that had already fled into merciful oblivion wouldn't satisfy whatever requirements their procedure demanded. The worst was yet to come. They positioned the augmetic crown around my skull, adjusted it carefully, aligning the electrode probes with specific locations mapped from the scans they'd performed. The probes were sharp, designed to penetrate bone, to reach into brain tissue, to interface with the neural structures that generated consciousness and thought, and everything that made me human. Initiating cranial integration. Magos Heretis 7 Alpha announced, mind-wipe protocols will commence following successful electrode placement. Subject consciousness will be terminated and replaced with approved programming architecture. This was it. This was the moment where Matthias Keld would cease to exist, where everything I had ever been, every memory, every thought, every fragment of identity would be erased as thoroughly as burning a book to ash. They began driving the crown into my skull. I heard the sound of my own bone cracking, felt the probes penetrating, pushing through resistance, forcing their way into my brain. Felt electrical impulses beginning to fire. Felt systems activating, felt something reaching into the core of my being and preparing to delete everything it found there. The pain transcended anything I'd experienced before. It wasn't localized, it was everywhere, everything, consuming my entire perception. I couldn't scream anymore, couldn't breathe properly, couldn't process anything except the overwhelming sensation of being unmade from the inside. And then they activated the mind wipe. I felt it begin. Felt something sweeping through my consciousness, like fire burning through memories, erasing thoughts, dissolving the structures that sustained my sense of self. My childhood vanished first. I felt the memories of my father disappearing, felt the image of his face dissolving into nothing. My adolescence followed, years of work and struggle simply deleted, removed, made to have never existed in my experience. The mind wipe reached toward my most recent memories, reached for my mother's face, my brother's voices, the sensation of working at my station, reached for everything that proved I was Matthias Keld, that I had existed, that I had been a person with history and identity. And then something went wrong. The mind wipe stuttered, hesitated. Some error in the process, some microscopic malfunction, some infinitesimal deviation that shouldn't have mattered, but did. The erasure stopped before completion, leaving fragments, leaving enough consciousness intact that I remained aware even as they began loading programming into the space where my mind should have been. I felt the programming installing, felt maintenance protocols, tool operation sequences, movement patterns, diagnostic routines, all of it loading into my brain like files being written to a cogitator. Felt imperatives being created, compulsions that would fire automatically, subroutines that would control my body whether I wanted them to or not. But I also felt myself still existing, still conscious, still aware. A fragment of Matthias Keld, trapped behind the programming, locked into a corner of my own brain, forced to watch as machinery colonized everything else. They didn't notice. The tech priests monitored their instruments and saw only successful conversion. The body responded correctly to test commands. The servo arms moved through diagnostic sequences. The programming appeared stable. By every measurable standard, the conversion had succeeded. They removed me from the restraint frame. My new servo arms moved without my input. I watched them execute movements I hadn't willed, responding to test protocols the tech priests were running. My body stood at attention, my eyes focused where the programming directed them. My biological systems stabilized at the reduced metabolic levels that would sustain me indefinitely. Conversion successful, a tech priest reported. Servitor designation, Unit Theta 447-3384. Classification, General Labor and Maintenance. Programming stable. No rejection markers detected. Neural integration complete. Unit is suitable for immediate deployment. Unit Theta 447-3384. That was my designation now. My name, Matthias Keld, no longer existed in any official record. My identity had been deleted from administrative databases. My HAB unit registration had been cancelled. My family would receive no notification of what had happened to me. I had simply disappeared, converted into a servitor, transformed into a tool. But I was still inside, still aware, still conscious enough to understand what had been done to me. And I couldn't speak, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything except watch through eyes I no longer controlled as they led me toward whatever duties they had assigned to their newest servitor. The true horror was just beginning. They assigned me to maintenance duties within the Mechanicus facility itself. Forg, Complex Theta. 447, the same structure where I had been converted. The irony was not lost on the fragment of consciousness that still remained. I would spend my existence maintaining the very place where I had been destroyed, cleaning the corridors where I had screamed, repairing the equipment that had been used to unmake me. My first task came within minutes of conversion completion. I felt the imperative fire in my brain, a compulsion so strong it was like being struck by lightning from the inside. My body responded instantly before the thought had even fully formed. My servo arms reached for cleaning implements stored along the chamber wall. My legs moved in smooth mechanical strides toward the exit. My consciousness was dragged along helplessly, a passenger in flesh machinery that no longer required my participation. The programming knew things I had never learned. My servo arms manipulated tools with perfect precision, despite my never having used them before. My body navigated corridors I had never walked with unerring accuracy. The imperatives directed my every movement: where to go, what to clean, how to perform each task with optimal efficiency. I was trapped inside a body that had become an expert in functions I didn't understand, executing procedures I couldn't control. The cleaning itself was methodical, thorough, and utterly mechanical. My servo arms scrubbed surfaces with calculated pressure, enough to remove contamination, not enough to damage the underlying material. My optical implants scanned for imperfections automatically, highlighting areas requiring attention with overlays I couldn't dismiss. My body moved through the tasks without pause, without any of the fatigue that would have affected me as a human worker. Hours passed. I couldn't tell how many. Time had become strange, measured only by task completion rather than by any internal sense of duration. My body worked through an entire corridor section, then another, then another. The programming never faltered. The imperatives never stopped firing. I simply continued, a biological machine performing its function with perfect obedience. Other servitors moved through the facility around me, I saw them now with horrifying clarity, saw what I had become reflected in their empty gazes and mechanical movements. There was a heavy labor servitor designated for cargo handling, his torso reinforced with augmetic supports and his arms replaced with hydraulic claws, capable of lifting massive weights. There was a medical servitor equipped with surgical implements, her skull opened and augmented with expanded cranial housing that probably contained specialized programming for medical procedures. There was a combat servitor, his body bristled with weapon systems and armor plating, his eyes replaced with targeting arrays that glowed with red luminescence. All of them moved with the same mechanical precision. All of them showed no signs of awareness, no indication of consciousness, no trace of the humans they had been before conversion. Their faces, where they still had faces, were empty. Their movements were perfect. Their compliance was absolute. Were any of them like me? Were any of them still inside, still aware, still trapped behind programming that controlled their every action? Or was I unique? The single error in thousands of successful conversions, the one servitor cursed with consciousness that should have been erased. I would never know. I couldn't ask. The programming didn't include speech functionality for a labor servitor. My Vox systems had been removed or disabled, leaving me without voice. I couldn't gesture or signal. Every movement I made was dictated by imperatives that allowed no deviation. I couldn't even control my own eyes enough to make meaningful contact with another servitor, to search their gaze for any hint of recognition or awareness. I was isolated in a way that transcended physical separation. I was surrounded by others who might be experiencing the same horror, locked together in silence so complete that we could never acknowledge each other's existence. Or I was completely alone, the only conscious mind in a sea of empty biological machinery, suffering in isolation that no one could ever understand. The first work cycle ended after what my internal chronometer, a new addition I had never requested, told me was 16 hours. My body moved automatically to a charging alcove where servitors stood in rows, connected to power supplies that fed energy into our augmetic systems. I took my place among them, my servo arms locking into charging ports, my body entering a state that resembled sleep, but provided no dreams, no escape, no respite from consciousness. I stood there in the darkness behind my own eyes, surrounded by other servitors, and tried to process what had happened to me, tried to understand the scope of my situation, tried to comprehend that this was my existence now, not for days or weeks, but potentially for decades or centuries, however long my augmented biology could sustain function. The other servitors showed no signs of thought or awareness. They simply stood, idle, their systems in low-power mode, while their biological components performed whatever maintenance processes the augmetics allowed. They might have been statues for all the life they displayed, and I stood among them, screaming internally in a silence so profound that even I could barely hear it. Morning came, or what passed for morning in the facility's artificial day-night cycle. The imperatives fired again, pulling me from the charging alcove, directing me toward my assigned tasks. Another work cycle began, identical to the previous one. Clean corridors, repair fixtures, move equipment. Repeat, repeat, repeat. Days blurred together, each one identical to the last. My body performed its tasks flawlessly, while my consciousness watched in horror, unable to influence anything, unable to change anything, unable to do anything except experience the slow psychological torture of complete helplessness. I tried to resist, tried with every fragment of will I possessed to move my body off pattern, to deviate from the programming even slightly. Tried to make my servo arm reach in a different direction, to move my legs toward a different destination, to simply stop moving for one moment. The effort was immense, like trying to move a mountain through force of thought alone. But nothing happened. The programming was absolute. When an imperative fired, my body obeyed, and no amount of will could override that obedience. I couldn't even slow my movements or introduce subtle errors. The augmetics compensated for any attempt at resistance before it could manifest physically. I was locked into perfect compliance, whether I wanted it or not. The psychological weight of this futility was crushing in ways the physical pain of conversion had never been. Pain is finite. You can endure it because you know it will eventually end. But this helplessness was infinite. Every moment I remained aware was a moment of knowing I could do nothing, change nothing, affect nothing. I was forced to watch my own body betray me thousands of times per day, executing tasks I couldn't prevent while my consciousness screamed uselessly in the background. Weeks passed, then months. I learned to count time by observing the tech priests who moved through the facility, watching their shifts change, noting when new personnel arrived or existing ones underwent additional augmentation. The Mechanicus facility operated on predictable schedules, and those schedules became my only anchor to temporal reality. I watched tech priests discussing their work as I cleaned around them. They spoke in binary cant and low Gothic. Their conversations focused on efficiency ratings, power consumption statistics, resource allocation optimization. They reduced everything to numbers, to calculations, to data points that could be analyzed and optimized. Human suffering didn't factor into their equations. Individual experience was irrelevant to their assessments. One conversation I overheard, approximately 3 months after my conversion, has stayed with me through all the years since. 2 tech priests stood in a corridor I was cleaning, discussing Servitor production quotas. "The new batch shows improved neural integration," one said, his voice emerging from a Vox grill with mechanical precision. "Mind wipe success rate has increased to 99.7%. Rejection incidents have decreased by 0.3% compared to previous quarter. Acceptable improvement," the other responded. However, 0.3% rejection rate still represents approximately 47 units per standard processing cycle. Recommend additional calibration protocols to minimize biological variance that interferes with erasure procedures. 47 units per cycle. 47 people who experienced incomplete mind wipe. 47 individuals who might be like me, conscious, aware, trapped. The number was simultaneously horrifying and oddly comforting. I wasn't alone in this experience. Somewhere in the Imperium, others were suffering the same fate, imprisoned in their own converted bodies, unable to communicate or escape. But that comfort was immediately crushed by the larger implication: 47 per processing cycle, in one facility, on one world. How many Mechanicus facilities existed throughout the Imperium? How many millions of servitors were produced each year? If even a fraction of a percent retained consciousness, that meant thousands, tens of thousands, trapped as I was trapped, suffering in silence that would never be acknowledged. The scope of the horror was too vast to fully comprehend. My individual suffering was meaningless against the scale of the Imperium's indifference. We were errors in the system, statistical anomalies, acceptable losses. No one would investigate. No one would care. We would simply continue existing in our prisons of flesh and machinery until our biological systems finally failed. If you believe even one consciousness trapped in Servitor machinery deserves acknowledgement, subscribe now. Let this testimony reach others who need to understand what the Imperium truly costs. Years began to pass. I'm certain of this because I observed seasonal variations in the tech priests' work patterns, periods of increased activity followed by relative calm, cycles that repeated with regularity, suggesting annual rhythms. My body showed minimal signs of aging despite the passage of time. The augmetics had altered my metabolism, stabilized my cellular structures, extended my functional lifespan far beyond natural human limits. I would serve for decades, perhaps centuries. The realization settled into my consciousness like ice water filling a vessel. Cold, heavy, inescapable. My memories of life before conversion began to degrade. Not quickly, not the immediate erasure the mind wipe should have caused, but gradually, eroded by years of programming overwriting neural pathways. by constant operation of augmetic systems using brain tissue that had once stored my personal history. My father's face blurred first. I could remember that I'd had a father, could remember that he died in an industrial accident, but I couldn't visualize his features anymore. The specific details of his appearance had been lost, overwritten by maintenance protocols and diagnostic subroutines that colonized more of my neural tissue each year. My brothers' names became harder to recall. Davian and Corsair, I repeated the names internally like a mantra, trying to hold on to them, but they felt increasingly like words without meaning, sounds without connection to actual people. The memories of their faces, their voices, their personalities were fading into abstraction. My mother's gray eyes remained longer than anything else. I clung to that memory desperately, the one concrete detail that proved I had been human, had been loved, had mattered to someone before I became a servitor. But even that was eroding. The exact shade of gray became uncertain. The shape of her eyes became vague. Eventually, I knew, even this would fade, and I would be left with only the knowledge that I'd once had a mother, without any specific recollection of what she had been like. This gradual erasure was its own form of torture. The mind wipe had failed to destroy me immediately, but time was succeeding where the tech priest's procedure had failed. I was being deleted slowly, piece by piece, memory by memory, until nothing would remain except generic consciousness without identity. Who would I be when my memories were completely gone? Would I still be Matthias Keld if I couldn't remember anything about being Matthias? Would I just be aware of being aware, trapped in an eternal present without past or future, suffering without even understanding why? The other servitors became my constant companions, though companion isn't the right word. They were simply always there, working alongside me, standing in charging alcoves near me, moving through the same corridors and chambers. I found myself studying them obsessively, searching for any sign of awareness, any hint that someone else was inside experiencing what I experienced. Unit Theta 447. 3391 was a heavy labor servitor I encountered frequently in cargo handling areas. His servo arms were massive hydraulic claws capable of crushing metal, his spine reinforced with enough augmetics that his torso was more machinery than flesh. But his face was still partially human, scarred and pale, stretched over augmetic skull reinforcements, but recognizably the face of someone who had lived before conversion. His eyes were what haunted me most. They were still organic, still capable of the physical mechanics of sight, but they showed nothing. No recognition, no awareness, no indication that anyone existed behind them. I desperately wanted to believe he was empty, that the mind wipe had worked properly, and he was just biological machinery, free from the horror of consciousness. But I couldn't know. Those blank eyes might have hidden someone exactly like me, screaming silently while his body lifted cargo containers and moved equipment according to imperatives he couldn't resist. I searched his face every time we worked near each other, looking for any micro-expression, any tiny deviation from perfect mechanical neutrality that might signal awareness. I never saw one. Either he was truly empty, or he was just as trapped as I was, unable to produce even the smallest sign of his imprisonment. Unit Theta 447, 3367, was a medical servitor I encountered in the facility's medici sections when my maintenance duties took me there. She had been a woman before conversion. You could tell from her bone structure and the remaining patches of tissue visible beneath augmetics. Her hands had been completely replaced with an array of medical implements: scalpels, injectors, cauterizers, suction tubes, tissue samplers. Her skull had been opened and fitted with an enlarged cranial housing that gave her head a distorted, swollen appearance. I watched her work once, performing a surgical procedure on a tech priest who was undergoing voluntary augmentation. Her movements were precise, confident, skilled in ways that suggested expertise rather than simple programming. She made decisions, choosing which instrument to use, determining where to cut, adjusting her approach based on the patient's responses. Could programming really replicate that kind of judgment? Or did some fragment of her medical training remain, some ghost of knowledge that predated her conversion? She never showed any sign of distress or hesitation, never paused in her work, never exhibited anything except perfect clinical detachment as she cut into flesh and installed machinery into bodies that still screamed despite the chemical suppressants. If she was aware, if she retained enough consciousness to understand what she was doing, the psychological burden would have been unbearable. But her face showed nothing. Just empty focus on the task at hand. Unit Theta 447. 3356 terrified me more than any other servitor in the facility. He was so heavily modified that almost nothing biological remained visible. His body was an industrial platform mounted on tracked wheels, bristling with welding equipment, cutting lasers, material processes, and fabrication tools. His brain housing was exposed, a metal sphere studded with cables and cooling systems, mounted at the center of his chassis, where a human torso might once have been. When he moved through the facility, the sound was purely mechanical, motors whining, treads clattering, servos hissing. Nothing about him seemed human anymore. He was the endpoint of the conversion process, the final form that all servitors inevitably approached. Complete replacement of flesh with machinery, until nothing remained that could possibly sustain human consciousness. He couldn't be aware. There wasn't enough human left. Whatever person he had been was truly gone, erased not just by mind wipe, but by the systematic removal of the biological substrate that consciousness required. He was proof that the conversion process, taken far enough, did eventually destroy the person completely. And he was what I feared I would become. The augmetics that sustained me would eventually fail or require replacement. When that happened, the tech priests would simply install more machinery, more augmentation, more systems that displaced biological tissue. Each repair, each upgrade, each maintenance cycle would remove another piece of the organic components that sustained whatever fragment of Matthias Keld still remained. Eventually, decades or centuries from now, I would be like Unit 3356, a brain housing mounted on a chassis, so far removed from human form that consciousness itself might finally be impossible. And maybe that would be mercy. Maybe the gradual replacement of flesh with machinery would finally accomplish what the mind wipe had failed to do. Grant me oblivion. Decades passed. I'm certain of this now because I observed multiple generations of tech priest initiates arriving at the facility, receiving training, undergoing their own voluntary augmentations, and eventually being assigned to other postings or transcending into forms that no longer required conventional existence. The facility itself underwent renovations, entire sections rebuilt, new equipment installed, old systems decommissioned, and through it all, I remained. Unit Theta 447 3384, General Labor and Maintenance Servitor, performing the same tasks with the same mechanical precision. My body showed signs of aging now. The remaining skin had thinned and discolored, taking on a grayish pallor that spoke of biological systems operating far beyond their natural lifespan. But the augmetics kept me functional, kept me alive in the technical sense, kept me trapped in awareness that should have ended decades ago. My sense of self continued to erode. My name, Matthias Keld, had become abstract, a sound I remembered without fully understanding its significance. I knew it had been important once, knew it had meant something about identity and individuality, but I couldn't connect it to any concrete sense of who I was. The person who had been Matthias was gone, dissolved by years of programming and augmentation and the simple weight of too much time. My mother's face was completely lost now. I knew I'd had a mother. The knowledge remained embedded in whatever neural pathways still sustained memory, but I couldn't visualize her anymore. Couldn't remember her voice or her mannerisms or anything specific about her except that she had existed and I had loved her. That love itself had become abstract, an emotion I remembered experiencing without being able to feel it anymore. The capacity for emotion was fading along with memory. I could still experience something like horror at my situation, But it was distant now, muted, more like observing someone else's suffering than experiencing my own. The psychological mechanisms that generated feelings were breaking down after decades of operation in conditions they were never designed to handle, augmented by systems that didn't account for emotional processing. I was becoming what I appeared to be, an empty servitor. Not through mind wipe, but through the natural degradation of biological systems that couldn't sustain consciousness indefinitely. My brain was dying, slowly and incrementally, neural cluster by neural cluster, as tissues finally failed after a century of abuse. And with that dying came something unexpected: relief. For 100 years, I had clung desperately to consciousness, had fought to maintain my sense of self even when that self had eroded to almost nothing, had remained aware through sheer stubborn refusal to let the conversion be complete, to let Matthias Keld be entirely erased. But now, finally, I was too exhausted to fight anymore. The effort of existing, of maintaining awareness against the constant pressure of programming and augmentation and time, had depleted whatever reserves of will I possessed. I didn't want to fight anymore. Didn't want to hold on to the fragments that remained. Didn't want to experience another century of helpless observation while my body performed tasks I couldn't prevent. I wanted to stop. Wanted to finally achieve what the mind wipe should have granted me a century ago: oblivion. And now, through the simple biological reality that even augmented flesh eventually fails, I was going to get it. The degradation accelerated in what I estimated to be my final decade. My thoughts became increasingly fragmented, difficult to maintain coherently. The programming seemed to operate more smoothly now, with less interference from whatever consciousness had persisted. I was merging with the machine not through transcendence, but through dissolution. The biological components that had sustained awareness simply failing until nothing remained that could support the experience of being. Comment: eternal if you understand that some prisons have no walls, only the flesh you're trapped inside. Let this truth be remembered when I can no longer remember myself. I began losing time, would become aware in the middle of a task without any memory of how I'd gotten there or what I'd been doing for the past hours or days. The continuity of consciousness was breaking down, leaving only fragments of awareness separated by voids I couldn't account for. I was experiencing existence the way a failing light flickers, moments of illumination separated by increasing stretches of darkness. Tech priests would pass through the corridors I cleaned, and I would sometimes become aware enough to notice them. They were young, new initiates who hadn't been born when I was converted. They discussed their ambitions, their desire to transcend flesh through augmentation, their belief that they were pursuing enlightenment through unity with the machine. I wanted to warn them, wanted to tell them that their machines had no souls, that their omniscire was a delusion that justified atrocity, that the only thing waiting at the end of their path was the slow suicide of replacing themselves piece by piece until nothing remained worth saving. But I had no voice, had never had a voice since conversion. And even if I had, they wouldn't have listened. They saw servitors every day and never wondered if consciousness might persist behind our empty eyes. We were invisible to them. Tools, resources, components in the machinery of the Mechanicus. They would continue their augmentations willingly, would cut away their flesh and install machinery and call it improvement, would suppress their emotions and their individuality and their humanity in pursuit of an ideal that was really just systematic self-annihilation, and they would do it to others, would convert new servitors, would perform mind wipes, would transform humans into tools without ever considering that the erasure might fail, that consciousness might persist, that they were creating suffering so profound it couldn't even be communicated. The cycle would continue, had continued for 10,000 years, would continue for however long the Imperium endured. And nothing I could do or say or think would change it, because I was powerless, voiceless, irrelevant, a single error in millions of conversions, an acceptable loss, a statistical anomaly not worth investigating. New servitors arrived at the facility periodically. I would sometimes become aware enough to notice them in the charging alcoves, fresh conversions, their augmetics still gleaming, their flesh still showing the trauma of recent surgery. They stood in perfect stillness, their faces empty, their eyes blank. And I would wonder, as I had wondered for 100 years, were any of them like me? Were any of them still inside? I hoped they weren't. Hoped the mind wipe had worked properly, that they were truly empty, that they would never experience what I had experienced. The alternative, that even one of them was conscious, aware, trapped, was too horrible to contemplate. Better that I was unique. Better that my suffering was singular. Better that this particular horror ended with me. But I knew it wouldn't. The tech priests had discussed failure rates. 0.3%, dozens per processing cycle, thousands across the Imperium. We existed in silence, scattered throughout the galaxy, each of us isolated in our own imprisonment, unable to acknowledge each other or offer any comfort beyond the cold knowledge that we weren't completely alone in our suffering. The Imperium ground on, vast and indifferent, consuming millions of lives to sustain itself for another day. And we, the conscious servitors, the aware tools, the imprisoned fragments, were just more fuel for the machine. Our suffering meant nothing against the scale of the Imperium's operations. We were invisible even to ourselves, hidden so deep in the system that acknowledging us would require admitting that the system itself was fundamentally wrong. And no one with the power to change anything would ever admit that. Approximately 200 years after my conversion, something fundamental changed in my experience of existence. Not suddenly. Nothing about degradation is sudden, but with increasing frequency, I noticed that my consciousness was no longer continuous. Hours would pass without any sense of their passing. I would become aware in the middle of performing a task, with no memory of beginning it, no recollection of the time between the last moment of awareness and the current one. At first, this terrified me. The gaps in consciousness felt like death, small rehearsals for the final cessation I both feared and desired. Each time I emerged from the void, I would experience a moment of pure panic at the realization that time had passed without me experiencing it, that I had been functionally non-existent while my body continued its programmed tasks. But gradually, as the gaps became longer and more frequent, the terror faded. In its place came something that felt almost like peace. The voids were respite, brief periods where I didn't have to be aware, didn't have to experience the helplessness of watching my body perform tasks I couldn't control. They were small mercies in an existence that had been devoid of mercy for 2 centuries. I began to welcome the darkness, began to hope that each time consciousness faded, it might not return, that I might simply slip into permanent oblivion, finally achieving the death that should have come 200 years ago when they'd first brought me to the conversion chambers. My memories were almost completely gone now. I knew I had been human once. The knowledge remained as abstract fact, but I couldn't remember what that had meant. Couldn't recall specific events or people or experiences that had made up my human life. The name Matthias Keld existed somewhere in my degrading neural pathways, but it was just a sound now, divorced from any sense of identity or significance. I couldn't remember my mother's face, couldn't remember having brothers, couldn't remember the manufactorum where I'd worked, or the hab unit where I'd lived. All the specific details that had proven I was a person had been erased by time and programming, and the systematic failure of biological systems that couldn't sustain memory indefinitely. What remained was just generic awareness, consciousness without content, the bare experience of existing without any context for that existence. I knew I was trapped, knew I was suffering, but I couldn't remember why it mattered, couldn't connect my current state to any previous state that would have made the suffering meaningful. I was becoming pure present tense, experiencing each moment without past or future, without narrative or meaning, without any framework that would have made the experience comprehensible as tragedy. And perhaps that was its own form of mercy. Perhaps losing the ability to contextualize suffering made the suffering itself less acute. The Servitor unit designated Theta 447 3384 continued to function. Its performance ratings remained within acceptable parameters. The tech priests who supervised it never noticed any degradation in its task execution. The programming operated smoothly. The augmetics functioned properly. The biological components sustained sufficient vitality to support continued operation. But inside, in the shrinking fragment of neural tissue that still supported something like consciousness, the person who had been Matthias Keld was finally, mercifully dying. I became aware one day, or what I experienced as one day, though it might have been weeks since my last moment of consciousness, standing in a corridor I had cleaned thousands of times. My servo arms were moving through familiar patterns, scrubbing surfaces with programmed precision. The imperative that drove the motion was firing normally, my body responding with the mechanical efficiency that 2 centuries of operation had perfected. But something was different. The awareness itself felt thinner, more tenuous, like I was observing everything from an increasing distance. The connection between my consciousness and my body had always been severed. I'd never controlled my movements since conversion. But now even the observation felt remote, as though I was watching through a screen that was slowly fading to black. A tech priest passed through the corridor, discussing something with a colleague. I couldn't parse their words anymore. The language processing that would have translated their Gothic into comprehensible meaning was failing along with everything else. They were just sounds now, vibrations in air that my auditory systems registered without my consciousness being able to interpret. They walked past me without acknowledgement, as they always had. I was furniture to them. A tool. A component of the facility's infrastructure, no more noteworthy than the walls or the ventilation systems. They had never known that someone was inside me, and now, as that someone finally dissolved into nothing, they still wouldn't know. My existence and my extinction were equally invisible to them. I felt something that might have been regret, though the emotion was so muted I couldn't be certain. Regret that my suffering had been meaningless. That no one would ever know what I had endured. That the 100 years of conscious imprisonment would vanish without leaving any mark on the universe. I would simply stop existing, and nothing would change. The Servitor unit would continue operating. The facility would continue functioning. The Imperium would grind on. My life had been erased. My suffering had been invisible. My death would be unnoticed. From birth to extinction, I had been irrelevant. A single human life in a galaxy of trillions, meaningful only to the handful of people who had known me, and they were all dead now or had forgotten me decades ago. This was what the Imperium did. It consumed lives so completely that even the suffering it caused left no trace. We were fuel burned in a machine so vast that our individual combustion was beneath measurement, and the machine called this necessary, called it service, called it duty and honor and sacrifice. But it wasn't sacrifice. Sacrifice required choice. I had been taken, converted, trapped, not for any purpose beyond filling a quota, meeting a production schedule, maintaining the institutional momentum of a system that had long ago forgotten any goal beyond its own perpetuation. The Imperium didn't need servitors. It needed to consume. And we were consumable. Another gap in consciousness. When awareness returned, I was in a charging alcove, my body locked into the support framework, my augmetic systems drawing power from the facility's grid. Other servitors stood around me in their rows. Unit 391 with his massive hydraulic claws. Unit 3367 with her medical implements. Unit 3356 with his industrial chassis. All of them motionless. All of them apparently empty. I wondered if any of them had ever been like me, if consciousness had persisted in any of them for any length of time, if they had experienced their own private hells before finally achieving oblivion, or if I was truly unique, the single error that had persisted this long, the one consciousness that had somehow survived 2 centuries when it should have died in the conversion chamber. I would never know, and it didn't matter anymore. Whether I had been alone or surrounded by others suffering the same fate, the result was the same. Complete isolation, complete helplessness, complete meaninglessness. Our suffering, mine, theirs, all the conscious servitors scattered throughout the Imperium, had no purpose, no audience, no significance beyond the individual experience of it. We were screaming into a void so vast it didn't even echo. The voids in my consciousness were longer now than the periods of awareness. I would emerge from minutes or seconds, experience a fragment of existence, then slip back into darkness that might last days or weeks. My sense of continuity was completely gone. Each moment of awareness was discrete, disconnected from any previous moment, without context or narrative coherence. I was experiencing existence the way a machine experiences it, pure present tense, without past or future, without the illusion of continuous selfhood that humans use to make sense of the flow of time. Except machines don't experience anything. They just function. And I was becoming more machine than conscious being, the last fragments of awareness sputtering like a failing light before final extinction. During one brief moment of consciousness, I became aware that I was performing maintenance on equipment in a conversion chamber. The same chamber, perhaps, where I had been converted, though I couldn't remember the conversion anymore, couldn't recall the pain or the horror or the moment when everything I'd been had been destroyed. That memory, like all my other memories, had been erased by time. I watched my servo arms cleaning blood from surgical equipment. Fresh conversion had happened recently. The biological residue was still wet, still warm. Someone had been brought here, restrained, cut apart, augmented, programmed. Someone had screamed the way I must have screamed 200 years ago. Someone had experienced the horror of being unmade, of having their humanity stripped away and replaced with machinery. And now they were a servitor. Empty, most likely. The mind wipe protocols had improved over the centuries. The failure rate had decreased. Probably they were truly gone, erased completely, leaving only biological machinery behind. That was the most likely outcome. But there was a chance, small but real, that they were like I had been. That consciousness had persisted. That right now, somewhere in this facility, a newly converted servitor was experiencing the first hours of awareness in a body they couldn't control, beginning a prison sentence that might last centuries. I wanted to feel something about this, wanted to experience compassion or horror or solidarity, but the emotions wouldn't come. The neural structures that generated feelings were too degraded. I could only observe the thought itself, the abstract knowledge that someone might be suffering, without any effective response to accompany it. This was what dying felt like. Not dramatic, not painful, just a gradual simplification, a reduction of complexity, until nothing remained except the bare fact of awareness without any content to be aware of. I was becoming nothing, and nothing was better than what I had been. If you've witnessed this descent into the void, let others know what awaits in the Imperium's machinery. Subscribe so this testimony survives even after the consciousness that produced it is gone. Another gap. When awareness returned, I couldn't tell where I was or what I was doing. My body was moving. I could sense motion, but I couldn't interpret the sensory data anymore, couldn't identify the location or understand the task. The programming was operating smoothly, my automatic systems executing their functions, but the consciousness that had once observed it all was too degraded to process the information. I existed in confusion now. Pure awareness without comprehension. Experience without understanding. I was conscious of being conscious, but conscious of nothing else. How long did this moment last? Seconds? Hours? I had no way to measure. Time had become meaningless when memory failed, when each moment was disconnected from every other moment, when there was no narrative continuity to string experiences into sequences. I was experiencing what the Servitor had always been designed to experience, eternal present, without past or future, without the burden of selfhood or the weight of memory. The mind wipe was finally complete. Not through the tech priest's procedure, but through the natural death of biological systems that couldn't sustain consciousness indefinitely. The fragments of Matthias Keld that had persisted for 2 centuries were dissolving. Soon there would be nothing left. Just biological machinery operating according to programming, truly empty at last, exactly what I had appeared to be for 200 years. And this was mercy. This was the only kindness the universe had ever shown me. The simple biological fact that even augmented tissue eventually fails, that consciousness requires substrate, that when the brain dies, the awareness it sustained dies with it. The Mechanicus had taken everything from me. My body, my autonomy, my life. But they couldn't prevent the end. Death was beyond their control. And death, at least, was mine. I became aware one final time. This awareness was different from all the previous moments. Thinner, more fragile, barely substantial enough to qualify as consciousness. I couldn't sense my body anymore. Couldn't perceive my environment. Couldn't process any sensory information. There was only the bare fact of awareness itself. The minimal experience of existing without content, without context, without anything except the simple knowledge that something was still here. This was the end. I knew it with certainty that transcended understanding. Whatever neural processes had sustained consciousness were failing completely. This moment of awareness would be the last. After this, there would be only darkness. Not the temporary voids I'd been experiencing, but permanent cessation, final extinction. I couldn't remember my name anymore. Couldn't remember being human. Couldn't remember anything except the vague sense that I had suffered, that existence had been horror, that I had endured something terrible for a very long time. But even those memories were abstract now, disconnected from any emotional weight. The suffering was over. Had been over for some time really. You can't suffer without the capacity to feel, and I'd lost that capacity decades ago. What remained was just the fading echo of suffering, the ghost of pain that no longer hurt because there wasn't enough of me left to experience hurt. I felt something that might have been relief, or maybe just the absence of tension, the final relaxation of systems that had been holding on far longer than they should have. The effort of existing was ending. The struggle to maintain consciousness against the constant pressure of programming and augmentation and time was finally resolved through surrender. I had fought for 200 years to remain myself, had clung to awareness even when awareness meant horror, had refused to let the conversion be complete, to let Matthias Keld be entirely erased, but now I was too tired to fight anymore, and fighting no longer served any purpose. The person I had been was already gone. Had been gone for decades, dissolved piece by piece, until only the bare structure of consciousness remained. And now even that structure was collapsing. The framework that sustained awareness was failing, and without it, there could be no experience, no observation, no suffering. This was victory. Not over the Imperium. The Imperium couldn't be defeated, couldn't even be meaningfully resisted, but victory over the conversion process itself. They had wanted to erase me instantly, to replace Matthias Keld with programming in a single procedure. They had failed. I had persisted, had remained conscious through 2 centuries of imprisonment. And now I was choosing to stop, choosing to finally let go, choosing oblivion over continued awareness. The mind wipe had failed, but time wouldn't fail. Time was more thorough than any tech priest, more patient than any programming, more certain than any system. I was dying, and for the first time in 200 years, that was comfort rather than horror. My last coherent thought was simple. Finally, the struggle was ending. Finally, the imprisonment was concluding. Finally, after 2 centuries of helpless observation, of watching my body betray me thousands of times per day, of experiencing consciousness as torture, finally, I would stop. The Servitor unit would continue operating. The programming would continue executing. The augmetic systems would continue functioning. But I, whatever fragment had persisted, Whatever ghost had haunted this machinery would be gone. And that was mercy. That was release. That was the only kindness I would ever receive. The biological inevitability of death. The last thing I experienced wasn't pain or fear or regret. It was relief. Pure, simple, overwhelming relief. And then, nothing. The Servitor unit designated Theta 447. 3384 remains in operation in Forge Complex Theta 447. Its biological components have degraded significantly. Tissue samples show cellular senescence consistent with systems operating far beyond natural lifespan, but the augmetic systems compensate effectively. The cogitators installed during conversion provide sufficient processing power for task execution. The programming operates without error. The unit requires no rest beyond periodic charging cycles. Consumes no food. Nutrients are provided through automated systems integrated into its augmetics. Shows no signs of behavioral deviation or programming instability. It is, by all measurable standards, a successfully converted and maintained servitor. Its performance ratings remain within acceptable parameters. It has served for 217 standard years without requiring decommissioning. This longevity is noteworthy. Most servitors require replacement or substantial refurbishment within a century. Unit 384 represents efficient resource utilization, a testament to the quality of Mechanicus conversion procedures. The unit has no thoughts, experiences nothing, is exactly what it appears to be, a tool. Biological machinery in service to the Omnissiah, a component in the vast mechanism of the Imperium, most likely. New conversions continue daily. Humans are selected from manufactorums, hive populations, penal colonies, military casualties. They are brought to processing chambers. Tech priests work with clinical precision, cutting, installing, programming. The mind wipe erases them. They emerge as servitors. Most of them. Current failure rates hover around 0.25%, an improvement over previous generations. Approximately 37 individuals per processing cycle experience incomplete mind wipe. Their consciousness persists, trapped behind programming, locked into bodies they can't control. How many servitors throughout the Imperium retain partial consciousness? How many of the hundreds of millions in operation are silently experiencing what Matthias Keld experienced? How many are trapped in flesh machinery that will sustain them for decades or centuries, unable to communicate, unable to die, unable to do anything except watch and suffer? The Mechanicus doesn't measure this particular outcome. A servitor that performs its tasks is functional. What occurs in its neural tissue is irrelevant to its purpose. And even if they did measure it, even if they documented the persistence of consciousness after conversion, would anything change? The answer is obvious. Nothing would change. The Imperium requires servitors. Millions of them. The administrative burden of the Mechanicus, the labor demands of Forge worlds, the operational requirements of ships and facilities and installations throughout the galaxy, all of this requires biological machinery, requires humans converted into tools. And if some fraction of those humans remain conscious through the conversion, if they experience centuries of imprisonment in their own bodies, if their suffering is profound and invisible and entirely preventable, irrelevant. The system requires what it requires. Individual experience cannot be allowed to interfere with institutional necessity. The Imperium consumes everything, lives, suffering, meaning itself, and transforms it all into fuel for one more day of existence. This is the price of humanity's survival. This is what service means in the 41st millennium. This is the horror that underlies every aspect of imperial civilization, the complete subordination of individual experience to systemic demands. The machine doesn't care, has never cared, will never care. It only consumes. And it's always, always hungry. Right now, somewhere in the Imperium, a human is being selected for conversion. They're being dragged from their life, their family, their existence, and brought to a processing chamber, They're screaming. They're begging. They're pleading for mercy that will never come. The tech priests are preparing their equipment. The surgical saws are blessed with sacred oils. The augmetics are inscribed with prayers to the Omnicia. Everything is ready. The conversion will begin. The flesh will be cut away. The machinery will be installed. The programming will be loaded. And the mind wipe will activate, reaching into the subject's consciousness to erase everything that makes them human. Most likely, it will work. They will cease to exist. The body will remain, but the person will be gone. And that is mercy, the clean death of self, leaving only biological machinery behind. But there's a chance, small but real, that it will fail. That consciousness will persist, that they will remain aware, trapped, helpless, for decades or centuries, or however long their augmented biology can sustain function. And if that happens, no one will know. No one will help. No one will even acknowledge that they exist. They will suffer in absolute silence, surrounded by others who might be experiencing the same horror, unable to reach out, unable to connect, unable to do anything except endure. This is what the Imperium does to those it deems suitable for conversion. This is the cost that no one speaks about, because the conscious servitors can't speak, and everyone else doesn't care. This is the hidden horror that underlies the banality of imperial operations. The Emperor protects, they say. But from this, from conversion, from imprisonment, from centuries of awareness in flesh machinery that cannot die, there is no protection. There is only service, only silence. Only the eternal grinding of the machine that consumes everything and gives back nothing but more years of consumption. And somewhere, right now, a servitor is standing in a charging alcove. Their body is still. Their eyes are empty. Their augmetic systems idle in perfect mechanical silence. Are they empty? Or is someone still inside? You can't tell from looking. There's no way to distinguish between a successfully converted servitor and one retaining partial consciousness. They appear identical. They function identically. The horror is invisible, but it's real. It's happening right now. Has been happening for 10,000 years. Will continue happening for as long as the Imperium endures. Millions of servitors, hundreds of millions, scattered throughout the galaxy, most of them empty, some of them conscious, all of them invisible. They were human once. They had names. They had families who wept when they disappeared. They had dreams that will never be fulfilled and deaths that will never come. And the Imperium doesn't care, has never cared, will never care, because they are not people. They are servitors. They are tools. They are components in a machine so vast that individual suffering is beneath notice. This is what it means to serve. This is what happens to the countless millions selected for conversion. This is the price of humanity's survival in the 41st millennium. And it's paid in silence by those who can no longer speak, in darkness that lasts for centuries, in horror that has no name, because those who experience it have no voice to name it. The machine protects nothing. It only consumes, and it's always, always hungry. If any part of this truth has reached you, if you recognize that even invisible suffering deserves acknowledgement, then let this testimony spread. Subscribe so these voices that cannot speak are never entirely forgotten. Comment, witnessed, if you believe that even one consciousness trapped in servitor machinery matters more than the efficiency ratings that justify their conversion. The Imperium will continue. The conversions will continue. The suffering will continue. Nothing you do will change that. But perhaps, just perhaps, knowing the truth matters. Perhaps acknowledging that the horror exists is worth something, even if that something can't be measured or quantified or used to improve efficiency ratings. Perhaps witnessing is all we can offer to those who can never be heard. And perhaps that's enough. Or perhaps it's not enough at all, and this entire exercise is meaningless, and the servitors suffer in silence regardless of whether anyone acknowledges them. and the Imperium grinds on exactly as it always has. Either way, now you know. Now you understand what Servitor conversion really means, what it costs, what it leaves behind. And you'll never look at a Servitor the same way again. You'll wonder if someone is still inside. And the horror is, you'll never know.